Okay. Capital Volume 1, Reader and North, the two poles. Hello, it's Distant Dat, 12th of November. TheAutonomousCollective.net, needless to say. So what we're going to look at today, and we're just going to go through this slowly because I think you'll either need to go through it on your own or in concert with other folks. And it's actually fairly important considering that several folks have just written entire books on this one chapter. So what I did was I made a copy, a print copy, or an image copy of uh, the two Pauls version of Capital Volume 1, Karl Marx by Karl Marx. And so I've included it here. I've included the footnotes or the endnotes as well, so you have a sense of what to stare at or whatever. And I've included the links to Google has a sample version available. And as I've discussed before, I tried having the text-to-speech readers sort of go through this, and with limited success, although I have been thinking of other ways of approaching the problem. That is, spend the time. It took me about 2 hours to copy the whole first chapter, just sort of cutting it up with little pieces and including it here. And was it worth the effort? Yes, I'd like to show that it does. So what I'm going to do is read first the older translation, first page or two, and then compare it to the second to this new translation. Before we get to that, I want to introduce the ideas that are still available to us as we've been looking at in the other context with Higginbottom of Volume 2. Namely that, as Higginbottom points out, and I hope that people have appreciated this now, that is that all three volumes kind of are interlocked, and you sort of don't read one without thinking about that there's another problem that is mentioned in one that is sort of worked out in two or three, and that's just the way the system is the way it's sort of constructed. It's the evolution not only of Marx's thought, but it is also a kind of discourse on method. And let's just think that's unimportant. It's actually a big deal, particularly in the German context. So let me note that I came across this set of diagrams. This was done several years ago, and mainly by someone who does work on David Harvey's approach to capital. So it has that sense of it, and doesn't include the clash that Higginbottom identifies with Harvey. And the fundamentals are still important. That is, Marx's method has interlocking features. That is, a relational mode of thought that goes back to Leibniz and Spinoza, a concept of totality, which is still with us, also Leibniz and Spinoza, the dialectic from Hegel, and of course the variation that Marx gives, post Feuerbach. That is, dialectical materialism is a method that seeks to identify the transformation rules through which society is restructured. So we have a relational mode of thought, a concept of totality, the dialectic, and then a system of sort of ideas, dualisms that need to be resolved. And those come from Kant. That is, man and nature, fact and value, subject and object, freedom and necessity, mind and body, and thought and action. And there's you don't have to go too far down the road with Kant, but Kant does wind up in a certain place that is maybe not as important or as direct as Marx. Although we do need Kant for certain other sets of ideas much later on. But they're necessary. I mean, if you want to think about any concept of law, you're going to want to read a little Kant on certain issues about justice. Anyway, and then you combine all these things, the practical methods of investigating material activities for production, political economists. That's what Marx is doing in Capital. He's saying, well, we make stuff, and then we exchange stuff. And as history moves, it gets a little more complicated, and the interrelations that define these sets of activities becomes more problematic because you begin to figure out, oh, well, am I getting everything that I need out of this stuff? How is it supporting me, this activity, which is an important activity? You go to work, I make a wage, I save stuff, bring stuff home, all those things that are just sort of basic parts of life. How fulfilling, how real is that? And the point that this particular guy who does the notes is the creation of theoretical practice through which we can fashion history rather than be fashioned by history. There's a certain idea about agency in here. Throughout this sort of thinking about all these things is that you're not sort of, locked into a kind of, that you're not predestined to any particular end or outcome. You have a certain amount of agency, and that agency comes from understanding one's sense of one's place in the world, that whole species being stuff. And the important thing for the chapter 1 of volume 1 is to kind of front load all these kind of things in there and to make them relatable. We can even think about it in a relatively simplistic way. That is, some members of the left argue that even to call Trump a fascist is probably too complicated for the average low intelligence voter. I mean, it's just, it just seems like a term that, the word bleep comes in, and it just, they don't quite know what it is or what it means, partially because most people don't do history very well or don't remember it in a useful enough way, and don't engage it with people that they're around unless, they have some other mitigating factor. So fascist probably was an overstep. And even to call Trump a misogynist, that automatically people's, must be far left, theoretical, big word, polysyllabic, blah, 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 blah. And you'll note, of course, that Trump, he knows what a misogynist, he knows he is a misogynist, but the word misogyny is just too, whatever, complicated, too opaque, too big. And so when Trump responded to a sort of surge in people calling him just simply a misogynist, not even just calling him a sexist, calling him a misogynist, and he responds to that, but in his own way, in his own simplistic way, and he says that he just loves women. He loves all women, which whatever that means. You could even interpret that as a Christian thing, which I wouldn't, but certainly he made a point of it for several days preceding the election. And that was his response to being called a misogynist. And he's never used the word misogynist lest he get to, well, he may not even know how to pronounce it, to utter it in that sense. But he knows what he is. And I think that that's the kind of interesting thing that's going on there. He knows what he was being called, but, there's this whole separate channel he lives in with these little siloed low information folks. And it's, we know that what it means relative to hating women, but the response is, well, that's not it. I'm negating that. I love women, blah, 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 or whatever. Anyway, that just gives you a sense of kind of, even in the present day, how much dialectic is sort of at work, the antagonisms that are at work in our daily lives. So I'm going to read the older version of the translation, which is online. It's been around for years. This is the one I think that is the same as the one that comes from the Penguin edition. So I'm going to read, it's not too long, and then I'm going to start with the reading the two Pauls version, the current version. And I don't know if you can tell the difference. I think you can see it by just reading, and whether you're listening or not, that whether you can hear it from listening may not be possible either. But there is a difference, and I think it is important to think about that, because the translation problem, or the lost in translation issues, are actually fairly major, and it was high time that at least from an American English idiomatic perspective, that we get a sense of doing what Marx wanted to do with it anyway, and that is front load volume 1 to make it more popular, to make it more intelligible. Not that it was going to make you run out in the streets and throw Molotov cocktails, but rather that it would give you the sense that this is not opaque or inaccessible. So the wealth of those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities, its unit being a single commodity. Our investigation must therefore begin with the analysis of a commodity. A commodity is, in the first place, an object outside us, a thing that by its properties satisfies human wants of some sort or another. The nature of such wants, whether, for instance, they spring from the stomach or from fancy, makes no difference. Neither are we here concerned to know how the object satisfies these wants, whether directly, as means of subsistence, or indirectly, as means of production. Every useful thing, as iron, paper, etc., may be looked at from the 2 points of view of quality and quantity. It is an assemblage, or assemblage, of many properties, and may therefore be of use in various ways. To discover the various uses of things is the work of history. So also is the establishment of socially recognized standards of measure for the quantities of these useful objects. The diversity of these measures has its origin partly in the diverse nature of the objects to be measured, partly in convention. The utility of a thing makes it a use value. But this utility is not a thing of air. Being limited by the physical properties of the commodity, it has no existence apart from that commodity. A commodity such as iron, corn, or a diamond is therefore, so far as it's a material thing, a use value, something useful. This property of a commodity is independent of the amount of labor required to appropriate its useful qualities. When treating of use value, we always assume to be dealing with definite quantities, such as dozens of watches, yards of linen, or tons of iron. The use values of commodities furnish the material for a special study, that of the commercial knowledge of commodities. Use values become a reality only by use or consumption. They also constitute the substance of all wealth, whatever may be the social form of that wealth. In the form of society we're about to consider, they are, in addition, the material depositories of exchange value. Exchange value, at first sight, presents itself as a quantitative relation, as the proportion in which values in use of one sort are exchanged for those of another sort, a relation constantly changing with time and place. Hence, exchange value appears to be something accidental and purely relative, and consequently an intrinsic value. For example, an exchange value that is inseparably connected with inherent in commodities seems a contradiction in terms. Let us consider the matter a little more closely. A given commodity, for example, a quarter of wheat is exchanged for X blacking, Y silk, or Z gold, etc. In short, for other commodities in the most different proportions, instead of one exchange value, the wheat has therefore a great many. But since X blacking, Y silk, or Z gold, etc., each represents the exchange of one quarter of wheat, X blacking, Y silk, Z gold, etc., must, as exchange values, be replaceable by each other or equal to each other. Therefore, first, the valid exchange values of a given commodity express something equal. Secondly, exchange value generally is only the mode of expression, the phenomenal form of something contained in it, yet distinguishable from it. Let us take two commodities, for example, corn and iron. The proportions in which they are exchangeable, whatever those proportions may be, can always be represented by an equation in which a given quantity of corn is equated to some quantity of iron. For example, 1/4 corn equals X counterweight iron. What does this equation tell us? It tells us that in two different things, in 1/4 of corn and X counterweight of iron, there exists in equal quantities something common to both. The two things must therefore be equal to a third, which in itself is neither the one nor the other. Each of them, so far as it is exchange value, must therefore be reducible to this third. Okay, so this is the last translation before the two Pauls got to it. And I'm going to read in a second here the latest translation version, and I hope that you can perceive a kind of difference in it. It may be a little too subtle, but I think it goes a little smoother from a readability point of view. The wealth of societies dominated by the capitalist mode of production appears in the form of an enormous accumulation of commodities. The individual commodity appears as the elementary form of that wealth. Hence, our investigation begins by analyzing the commodity. The commodity is, first of all, an external object, a thing whose properties satisfy human wants or needs of whatever kind. The nature of these wants and needs, whether they come from our belly or from our imagination, doesn't matter here. It also doesn't matter how an object satisfies, whether directly as a means of subsistence or enjoyment, or indirectly as the means to produce something else. Every useful thing, iron, paper, etc., can be considered from two perspectives at once, that is, quality and quantity. Since every such thing is a whole that combines many properties, it can be useful in different ways. Discovering these ways, and thus the diverse applications of a thing, is a historical act. So is the creation of the society's standards for measuring amounts of useful things. Standards of measurement for commodities differ in part because of the natural differences among the objects measured, in part by convention. The usefulness of a thing makes it into a use value. Usefulness, in this sense, doesn't hover above us in the air. Determined by the property of a commodity's body, it would not exist without them. Thus, a commodity's body, as with iron, wheat, diamonds, etc., is itself a use value or good. Now, whether or not it has this character doesn't depend on how much work or how little human beings have to do to appropriate its useful properties. When considering use values, we always suppose that we're dealing with definite amounts. For example, dozens of watches, yards of linen, tons of iron. The use values of commodities supply the material for an independent discipline, commodity studies. Use value is realized only when something is used or consumed. Whatever social form wealth takes, use values make up its material content. Within the form of society that concerns us here, they also function as the material bearers of exchange value. exchange value first appears as a quantitative relation, the ratio in which one type of use value is exchanged for another. This relation changes constantly, varying with time and place. Exchange value thus seems to be something accidental and purely relative, and the idea of exchange value is something inherent in, valeur intrinsique, or immanent to a commodity seems to be a contradictio in adjecto. But let's just take a closer look. A single commodity, say 8 bushels of wheat, can be traded for other goods in the most diverse ratios of exchange. But the wheat's exchange value remains the same whether it's expressed as this much boot polish, that much silk, this much gold, or something else. Its exchange value then must have a content that can be distinguished from these different modes of expression. Let's now consider two commodities, for instance, wheat and iron. Whatever their relationship of exchange may be, it can always be represented as an equation in which some quantity of wheat equals some quantity of iron. 8 bushels of wheat, for example, equals 100 pounds of iron. Now, what does this equation say? That the same amount of a common something exists in two different things, 8 bushels of wheat and 100 pounds of iron. These two things are thus equal to a third, something that in and for itself is neither the one nor the other. Each, insofar as it is an exchange value, must be reducible to that something. And it goes on further. So those are two elements, and I don't know if you can tell that there is a difference. I think you have to sort of determine that in your own reading practice, whether you think it moves a little better with more intelligibility or not. It is this idea that a commodity is a abstract something rather that helps us consider the relationship of seemingly dissimilar things to each other. And you can say, thinking ahead, oh, well, this is where, we kind of think about these abstract things that we can use, like, for example, money. But we haven't gotten to money yet. We're just still talking about them in something that's not money, something called a commodity, because it expresses a whole system of exchanges for all kinds of folks who have individual and sometimes collective use values in their minds. What am I going to use this for? What can I use this for? I can actually resell it or re-exchange it or whatever. So there's a bunch of other things that are certainly possible, but we begin with the simplest of distinctions. So in continuing further with the Paul's translation, now we're past that particular point where we're making that comparison. A simple geometric example will illustrate this point. In order to establish and compare the surface areas of rectilinear figures, we redraw them as triangles, then reduce the triangles to an expression very different from their visible shapes. 1/2 the base times the height. The exchange values of commodities are likewise reduced to a common something, which they represent in greater or smaller amounts. So we're talking about degrees of abstraction, moving to geometry, which is an interesting idea and really important, regardless of one's intelligence, whatever. This common something, though, can't be a geometrical, physical, or chemical property or any of the commodity's natural properties. The physical properties of commodities matter only insofar as they make commodities useful and thus into use values. But what characterizes the exchange relation of commodities is clearly that it involves abstracting from their use values. Within this relation, one use value counts for exactly as much as any other, given the right proportion. Or, as old Barbon says, one sort of wares are as good as another if the value be equal. There is no difference or distinctions in things of equal value, which is sort of a tautology. As use values, commodities differ above all with respect to quality. As exchange values, they can differ only with respect to quantity, and they contain not even an atom of use value. So here we can see what is being separated here, that use value, it has a separate category or quality that is not necessarily part of, that use value and exchange value are not perfectly identical. if we set aside the use value belonging to the physical bodies of commodities, just one quality remains. They're products of labor. But the product of labor, too, has been transformed in our hands. If we abstract from its use value, we will be abstracting also from the physical components and forms that made it into a use value in the first place. The product of labor is no longer a table, house, spool of yarn, or any other useful thing. All its sensuous components are wiped away. Neither is it any longer the work of carpentry, construction, weaving, or some other particular kind of productive labor. When the useful character of labor products disappears, so too does the useful character of the instances of labor represented in them. What happens in effect is that the different concrete forms of those instances of labor vanish as well. They can no longer be distinguished from one another and have all been reduced to the same human labor, that is, abstract human labor. So let's go to what remains of these labor products. Nothing of them is left over except the same ghostly objecthood, a bare, gelatinous blob of undifferentiated human labor power expended without regard to the form of its expenditure. All that these things still represent is this: when they were made, human labor power was expended, human labor accumulated as crystallized pieces of this social substance, which they consist of collectively. They are values. So you can see there's a kind of little, it is abstraction, but there's specific categories of abstraction and are also a series of transformations of whatever this other thing might be to something a little bit more tangible, but not maybe fully tangible. But it is something that has value. And that's he's trying to move you toward, well, what is this character of these things by which we give them importance? We count them. They're, something's connected to all of these. And this process of projecting meaning on these things is, the kind of value formation process. The exchange value of commodities presented itself to us in their exchange relations as something fully independent of commodities' use values. If we now abstract from the use value of labor products, we will arrive at their value as it was defined above. The common something expressed by commodities exchange relations or exchange value is in fact their value, that is sort of big V value, that common something. The course of this examination will eventually bring us back to the notion of exchange value as value's necessary mode of expression or form of appearance. Now, without lurching off into semiotics, but that's the kind of component for some points of view on signs, is that they're on the one hand simply acts of communication without any particular kind of value, but that they're also expression, whereas they express a certain decision making about assigning meaning or value to something. Okay, back to Marx. First, however, we need to consider value without taking that form into account. A use value or good has value only because abstract human labor is objectified or materialized in it. Now, how should the magnitude of its value be measured? By the amount of value-creating substance it contains, labor. The amount of labor is measured by its duration, and labor time has its own standard of measurement in definite units of time, such as hours, days, and so on. Now, we might be tempted to think that since the amount of labor expended to produce a commodity determines its value, the lazier or more incompetent the person producing it, the more valuable the commodity might be. After all, it will take longer to produce it. But the labor that constitutes the substance of values is equal human labor, the expenditure of the self-same human labor power. All the labor power represented and the values of the commodity world, the sum of the society's labor power represented in them, counts for something here as one and the same human labor power, even though labor power belonging to innumerable individual people goes into it. Each person's labor power is the same human labor power as any other person's. insofar as it has the characteristic of being socially average labor power and functions as such socially average labor power, which means that it requires only the labor time necessary on average, the labor time socially necessary to produce a given commodity. Socially necessary labor time is the labor time needed to produce a given use value under a society's normal conditions of production, using labor that has an average level of skill and intensity. When the power loom was introduced in England, the labor needed to turn a given quality of yarn into fabric likely fell to half of what it had been. The English hand weaver had to expend as much labor time as ever to transform the same amount of material, but now the product of this individual labor hour represented only half of a social labor hour, and thus its value dropped by half. It is solely the quantity of socially necessary labor, or the socially necessary labor time, that goes into making a use value that determines its magnitude of value. Here, each individual commodity counts for something only as an average instance of its type. Commodities that contain equal amounts of labor, in other words, commodities that can be produced in the same amount of labor time, will therefore have the same magnitude of value. A commodity's value has the same relation to the value of every other commodity that the labor time required to produce it has to the labor time required to produce every other commodity. As values, all commodities are nothing but discrete masses of coagulated labor time. Now, let me stop there for a second and say, this is where, it gets, reified or whatever. The issue of congealment or coagulated labor time becomes either a literal or a figurative problem for many people. How is it that we get to the average? Is it an average person? Is it 6 feet tall, 160 pounds, working at an average labor time of 8 hours, blah, 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 blah. That's kind of where he's headed, but he doesn't want to sort of overvalue it as though you could sort of, optimize it around a single type. Now, that being said, you could say that under AI or robotics, that you could get something of an average thing that would expend all of that would have these attributes and work kind of much more uniformly. And that kind of solves some of what Marx is trying to get at when he says, well, this sort of represents an average kind of thing. And what we're trying to do is get some numbers. It's just seeking some kind of structural stability for talking about this sort of stuff. And as I've said before, we'll get back to the text in a second, as I've said before, things like the Communist Manifesto and various pamphlets are meant to appeal to workers, who, can only, with all due respect, given education levels, et cetera, they can sort of understand most of it in this kind of way, that there must be some kind of average, that I know I'm expending some kind of labor power. I'm working for a certain amount of time. It gets more complicated when there's, differential wages and a whole bunch of other things, but those don't make it necessarily difficult, but it does show that there are measures that can be calculated. A commodity's magnitude of value will not vary then, as long as the amount of labor time needed to make it remains constant. But the labor time it takes to produce a commodity varies whenever labor's productive power does. A number of factors determine labor's productive power, including workers' average skill level, how far scientific knowledge and its technological applications have developed, the social organization of the production process, the scope and efficiency of the means of production, and conditions in nature. The same quantity of labor that is represented in 8 bushels of wheat during a good harvest might, for example, be represented in only 4 bushels of wheat during a bad one. The same quantity of labor will extract more metal from rich mines than poor ones, and so on. Diamonds are hard to find in the Earth's crust. Discovering them thus requires, on average, a lot of labor time. And from this, it follows that much labor is represented in a small quantity of diamonds. Jacob doubts that the price of gold has ever corresponded to its full value. That is even truer of diamonds. In 1823, according to Eschwege, the spoils from Brazilian diamond mines over the previous 80 years didn't equal the total price of 1.5 years of the country's average sugar or coffee production, even though the diamonds represented far more labor and thus more value. Applied to more bountiful mines, the same quantity of labor would be represented in a larger number of diamonds, and the diamond's value would therefore fall. That is, we could easily turn coal into diamonds. If we could easily turn coal into diamonds, their value would drop below that of plain bricks. Now, needless to say, intuitively, you know that diamonds can now be grown, and that changes the nature of all these relationships. And in fact, raises a much more contradictory problem relative to price. In general, the greater labor's productive power, the smaller the amount of labor time needed to make a good. And the smaller the amount of labor crystallized in a good, the smaller its value. Now, the reverse is also true. The less productive power labor has, the greater the labor time needed to produce a product, and in turn, the greater a product's value. A commodity's magnitude of value varies directly with the amount of labor realized and inversely with that labor's productive power. A thing can be a use value without being a value. And this is where he's trying to make this distinction between use value, exchange value, and big V value. This happens when labor doesn't mediate a thing's usefulness for human beings, as with air, virgin soil, naturally occurring meadows and trees, and so on. A thing can also be both useful and a product of human labor without being a commodity. Anyone who satisfies one of his own wants or needs with something he produced is made a use value, not a commodity, because to produce a commodity is to produce not only a use value, but also a social use value, a use value for others. Finally, nothing can be of value without being a use value. If a thing is useless, then so is the labor it contains. The labor doesn't count as labor and thus generates no value. Now, I'll read a little further on, but this is actually, this is going to take forever. But I would hope, let me stop here and ask if people have questions or issues or things that need to be explained. Okay, hearing none. Go to number 2, the double character of the labor represented in commodities. That is, a commodity represents a bunch of things, and it does represent, labor, certainly, among other things. First, the commodity presented itself to us as a double something, that it's both use value and exchange value. We then saw that labor, too, when it is expressed as value, loses the particular qualities it has as that which produces use values. I was the first to offer a critical account showing that the labor contained in commodities has such a double nature. Since this point has to be the nub of any real attempt to understand political economy, we need to examine it more closely here. Let's say that we have two commodities, a coat and 10 yards of linen. That is, it's on a bolt and it's, flat and, folded up, as opposed to the coat that you wear. The former, that is the coat, has twice the value of the latter. And so if 10 yards of linen equals V, the coat equals 2 times V. The coat is a use value that satisfies a specific want or need. To make the coat, a certain kind of productive activity is required. This activity is defined by its goal, method, object, means, and result. As shorthand, we'll say that useful labor is the kind whose usefulness is represented in the use value of the product it makes, or in the product itself in such a way that the product is a use value. When we view labor from this perspective, we always consider it in terms of its useful effects. Just as the use values coat and linen are qualitatively different, so too are the forms of labor they owe their existence to. That is, tailoring and weaving. You rarely see weaving itself happen. Even in the act of knitting, it's not really, not quite there, but it resembles it, which is why I think a lot of people, sort of identify with it. If these things were not qualitatively different use values, and thus the products of qualitatively different forms of useful labor, they couldn't interact as commodities. A coat is not exchanged for an identical coat. A use value is not exchanged for the same use value. Appearing in the diverse totality of use values, or the physical bodies of commodities, is yet another totality, just as multifarious. That of the distinct species, varieties, and subvarieties of useful labor constituting a social division of labor. The social division of labor makes it possible for commodity production to exist. But the reverse isn't true. Commodity production isn't needed in order for the social division of labor to exist. In the ancient communities of India, labor is socially divided, but this doesn't mean that its products become commodities. Or, to take an example closer to home, labor is systematically divided in every factory. Yet this division doesn't presuppose that the workers exchange their individual products. Only the products of separate instances of private labor carried out independently of one another can interact as commodities. So readers have seen that embedded in every commodity's use value is an instance of useful labor, purposeful, productive activity of a particular kind. Use values cannot interact as commodities if qualitatively different instances of useful labor aren't embedded in them. In a society whose products generally take the form of commodities, that is, in a society of commodity producers, where instances of useful labor produced independently of one another as the private business of independent producers, this qualitative variety develops into a complex system, a social division of labor. Now, it doesn't matter to the code. In any case, whether the tailor himself wears it or his customer does. The code functions as a use value in both scenarios. Similarly, it's no effect on the nature of the coat's relation with the labor that produces it, whether or not tailoring has become a specialized profession, an independent pursuit within the social division of labor. Driven by their need for clothing, human beings made coats for thousands of years, doing a tailor's work before a single person became a tailor. Coats, linen, and other items of material wealth not found in nature have to be brought into being by a particular kind of purposeful, productive activity, one that assimilates specific natural resources to specific human wants or needs. As the creator of use values as useful labor, labor is a condition of human existence independent of all forms of society. It is an eternal, natural necessity needed to mediate the human metabolizing of nature and thus to mediate human life itself. So you can see that Bellamy Foster thing about metabolics is right there and right at the front end. Use values such as coats and linen, in short, the physical bodies of commodities, combine two elements: natural materials and labor. It could remove all the different instances of useful labor embedded in coats, linen, and so on. What would be left? Always is the material substrate that exists in nature prior to any human activity. So there's something there. Not that you're going to set anything on fire or anything, but there's ways in which you can sort of identify those things. As producers, human beings can, in a sense, operate only as nature does. All they can do is change the form of matter. In addition, they draw constantly on natural forces to carry out this labor of reshaping. Labor isn't the lone source responsible for the use values it produces, or for material wealth. It is their father, to speak with William Perry, and the earth is their mother. Moving on from the commodity as a useful object, let us now turn to commodity value. The coat in our example has twice the value of the linen, a purely quantitative difference that doesn't concern us at the moment. Thus, it should suffice simply to remind readers that if the value of the coat is twice that of 10 yards of linen, then 20 yards of linen has the same magnitude of value as the coat. As values, the coat and the linen are things made up of the same substance. They are objective expressions of homogeneous labor. But tailoring and weaving are qualitatively different forms of labor. There are, of course, social conditions in which a single person still alternately tailors and weaves, and these ways of working represent modified versions of a single individual's labor rather than the clearly demarcated functions of different individuals. Just as the coat our tailor makes today and the pants he makes tomorrow simply imply variations of the same individual labor. One can see, moreover, that in our capitalist society, a given portion of human labor now turns to tailoring, now weaving, changing what it perceives as demand for labor varies. This shape shifting on labor's part doesn't happen without friction, but it has to happen. If we now set aside the particular nature of a productive activity and thus the useful character of the labor involved, all that remains is an outlay of human labor power. Although tailoring and weaving are qualitatively different as productive activities, when people engage in the one just as when they engage in the other, they productively expend the power of their brains, muscles, nerves, hands, and so on. Tailoring and weaving, in this sense, are human labor. They are merely two different forms in which human labor power is expended. Human labor power certainly needs to develop to this or that point in order to be expended in this or that form. But a commodity's value represents all human labor as such, only an outlay of human labor in general. Just as military commanders and bankers play a big role in bourgeois society, whereas human beings in general have a kind of puny one, so it is here with human labor too. Human labor is the expenditure of simple labor power, the labor power that on average normal human beings possess in their physical organism without any special training. While what counts as this simple average labor varies according to country and cultural epoch, it's given in a particular society. More complex labor merely counts as enhanced or better multiplied simple labor, meaning that a smaller quantity of complex labor equals a greater quantity of simple labor. Experience shows that this reduction is constantly occurring. A commodity can be the product of the most complex labor. Value, however, makes it equal to the product of simple labor, and thus its value represents only a certain amount of simple labor. The diverse ratios in which diverse forms of labor are reduced to simple labor as their unit of measurement are established by a social process that takes place behind the backs of the producers, and so these ratios seem to them to be governed by tradition. In what follows, every type of labor power will be considered as simple labor power. This will spare us the trouble of reducing one type to another. So he's already trying to make certain things more constant or more uniform. With the values coat and linen, the difference between their use values is abstracted away, and the same thing happens with the labor represented in them. The difference between the useful forms of the two kinds of labor, tailoring and weaving, is abstracted away too. As use values, the coat and the linen unite a purposeful, productive activity with raw cloth and raw yarn, respectively. But as values, they are bare, gelatinous blobs of homogeneous labor. Thus, the instances of labor contained in these values count for something not because of their productive relationship to cloth and yarn, but rather only as outlays of human labor power. Tailoring and weaving can go creating coats and linen as use values only because those two kinds of labor have different qualities. They can constitute the substance of coats and linen as values only insofar as their particular qualities are abstracted away, and they possess the same quality, the quality of being human labor. But the coat and the linen are not only values as such, they're values of a particular magnitude. According to our premise, one coat has twice as much value as 10 yards of linen. Where does the difference between their magnitudes of value come from? From the circumstance that the linen contains half as much labor as the coat. In order to produce the coat, labor power has to be expended for twice as long as it takes to produce the linen. If the labor contained in a commodity counts for something only qualitatively with respect to use value, that labor counts for something only quantitatively with respect to magnitude of value once it has been reduced to human labor without further properties. First case, what matters is now how the labor is performed and to what end. In the second, what matters is how much and for how long. Because a commodity's magnitude of value represents nothing but the amount of labor it contains, there must be certain ratios in which commodities are values of the same magnitude. If the productive power of tailoring remains constant, and so does that of all the other useful labor needed to make a coat, the value of the coat produced will increase along with their number. One coat will represent X workdays. Two coats will represent 2X workdays, and so on. Now imagine if the labor that goes into producing a coat doubled or fell by half. In the first scenario, one coat would have as much value as two coats had formerly. In the second, two coats would have as much as one used to have, even though in both cases, a given coat would perform the same function, and the useful labor contained in it would be of the same quality as before. But the quantity of labor expended to produce it would have changed. In and for itself, a greater quantity of use value amounts to greater material wealth. That is, two coats amount to more than one. Two coats can clothe two people, one coat just one person. Yet when the quantity of material wealth increases, this can also correspond to a simultaneous drop in its value. This opposing movement arises from the double character of labor. Productive power is, of course, always the productive power of useful, concrete labor, and it determines only how much a purposeful, productive activity can achieve in a given amount of time. Useful labor makes more or fewer products in direct proportion to how much its productive power increases or decreases. But variations in productive power have no effect at all on the labor represented in value, on that labor in and for itself. Since productive power only has to do with the concrete useful form of labor, it naturally ceases to have any bearing on labor the moment labor's concrete useful form is abstracted away. The same labor of the same duration will always yield the same amount of value, regardless of whether its productive power varies. Within a certain amount of time, however, labor will create different amounts of use values, more when its productive power increases, fewer when it decreases. The same change in productive power that increases the fruitfulness of labor, and therefore the number of use values created, will reduce the total magnitude of value belonging to the larger final quantity if it shortens the total amount of labor time needed to produce that quantity, and vice versa. Let me stop here for a second. What Marx is trying to do is try to get a sense of what goes on after, with Smith talks about division of labor and, how much value increases with increased efficiency relative to dividing up tasks. On the one hand, all labor is human labor power expended physiologically. It is in this capacity as equal human labor or abstract human labor that labor creates commodity value. On the other hand, all labor is human labor power expended in a particular form that is determined by a goal. It is in this capacity, or as concrete useful labor, that labor produces use value. And next is the thing that, has got a lot of people bent out of shape or wishing to go back to the humanist roots to work through exactly what we're looking at in the first chapter. The value form or exchange value. Commodities come into the world in the form of use values or physical commodity bodies, such as iron, linen, wheat, and so on. It is their homespun natural form. They are commodities only as a double entity, that is, at once a use object and a bearer of value. Thus, they appear as commodities or have the form of commodities only insofar as they have this double form, a natural form and a value form. The value objecthood of commodities differs from mistress quickly in that one knows not where to have it. Not even an atom of natural material goes into their value objecthood, in striking contrast to their objecthood as physical commodity bodies, which is a crude thing for the senses. However, one might twist and turn an individual commodity as a value thing, it remains ungraspable. But we need to remind ourselves that commodities possess value objecthood only insofar as they are expressions of the same social denominator, human labor, and that their value objecthood is thus purely social. Now, you sort of get a sense of that on Met Gala night, when somebody describes, it took X amount of hours to sew all these rhinestones or beads onto this dress, whatever, as though that said something about its actual value. This point should make the following one clear. The value objecthood of commodities can appear only in the social relation between commodity and commodity. In fact, we begin with exchange value or the exchange relation of commodities in order to pick up the trail of what this value hidden within it. Let's now turn back to exchange value, that form of appearance of value. Everybody knows, even if they know nothing else, that commodities have a common value form that contrasts in the most dramatic way with the diverse natural forms of their use values. That is, the money form. But here, I want to do something bourgeois political economists have never even attempted. Lay bare its genesis, or in other words, trace the development of the value expression contained in the value relation of commodities, starting with the simplest and most inconspicuous form, and proceeding all the way to the dazzling money form. With that, the whole enigma of money will also be solved. The simplest value relation is obviously one commodity's value relation with a single commodity of a different kind, any different kind. The value relation of two commodities provides us then with the simplest expression of commodity value. So X commodity A equals Y commodity B, or X commodity A is worth Y commodity B. So 20 yards of linen equals one coat, or 20 yards of linen is worth one coat. So the next section is on the two poles of a value expression, relative value form and equivalent form. And I think I've proceeded up to my maximum time by now. Yes, I have. So I'm going to stop right there and ask if people have any questions. It can be a little confusing. And with respect, Marx, despite the translation, kind of has overlapping meanings that he doesn't quite work out, even though they've translated to the best of their ability. No, it may take a little bit of time to sort of work through what, but I think considering, as I said before, that entire books have been built on this one chapter, and it is front loaded with, I mean, every darn problem, of Marx's Capital is sort of squished forward in the first volume, and sometimes it works, sometimes it's a little confusing, and you need to sort of get the sense of what he means by it. And of course, there are plenty of commentators who are working on this exact problem. So let me show a different way of approaching this. So if we do this, and then we go down, and if you look at the notation section, the bottom notes, and I'd like to think that the yammering in the notes is really important, because it is the product of the two Pauls sort of trying to get through this. So they identify the specific edition number that they're trying to work with, and as it has been described before, they're working from the second edition translation, which has a variety of things that are more useful or that are already fixed or whatever. And things that need to be sort of, articulated further. So, what that desire for the mind is maybe not the same thing as desire for the body. Um, and then other things that are less obvious about certain objects, magnetism, for example, for iron. Um, and then the question of what is fit or unfit. And needless to say, this past week has been an issue of who is fit or unfit for duty in that same way. And then a governing notion in bourgeois societies is the fictio juris, that every person who buys commodities also has an encyclopedic knowledge of them. Editors note here, fictio juris means an assumption or presupposition that runs counter to reality. For those of us who are got sufficiently into the importance or necessity to elect Kamala Harris, all's the more the grief and shock that has occurred in not achieving her election, and that difference between, there's some people who do not have encyclopedic knowledge of anything, much less their own very relatively simple lives, and it is that's the problem of media and mediation, and one that is tragically obvious 1 week since the election itself. So anyway, let me stop there and prepare to cut the live stream unless there's some pressing issues or questions or problems, because I didn't see any necessarily. Oh, yes. Kelly did post something interesting here, and this is that connection back as North and Reitter do to that metabolic moment, that one sentence about metabolism. Every organic being, in other words, participates at each and every moment in what Marx calls the universal metabolism of nature, and what Engels calls universal what Engels called the metabolism that in the long run occurs everywhere, affecting both inorganic and organic existence. All life is in continuous metabolic interchange with the natural environment that surrounds it. This is important because you have a kind of mechanical view of a lot of things, including nature and other matters that, they're problematic sets of belief. People need to think more abstractly in the 19th century, and they don't quite get to it fast enough or get it integrated. And so you have a variety of controversies that runs havoc with, scientific progress, for example. Some people will only adhere to a certain line, a system of beliefs, and it becomes an ideological position whether you're going to shift people out of that. And similarly, we have this motive analysis for the last election about, was it fair? Was it rigged? Was it true that Latinos reject a left-wing analysis, a so-called far left analysis of Donald Trump? And that's false too. But it's interesting to see how certain ideological positions have already been staked out, and we're kind of bussing through them this week. It's depressing to see them sort of pop up, partially because some have very vested interests in a certain degree of ideology and are willing to prop it up with scant evidence. So, for example, Baron Trump is now being credited with a whole strategy of, the maniverse, young male culture that some attribute the winning of the election to. Data doesn't support that, but it is clear that there were. I mean, it doesn't deny that it happened, but its actual effect is probably up to more close analysis. And as I've recently stressed, that we really do have to look with a microscope at every swing state to see exactly what the votes were. This is that moment where the anonymity of the casting of a vote as a selection of one or the other with a first to the post, you know, conclusion or winning, you know, um, all of that really actually needs to be even more transparent than it is. And not because we necessarily think that hanky panky or shenanigans has occurred, but it just would be sort of useful to note that every ballot does have a serial number. And, you know, this is all computers are actually a good thing. It could actually work through this problem. The issue, of course, is um, you know that the 2000 election for the election in 2000 Gore Gore versus Bush hung on some things that probably aren't are really problematic. Those hanging Chad things changed the nature of what a yes or a no, an affirmative or a you know an on and off a kind of selection of a particular thing for a line is, and uh, that's that's a case where you know you're kind of manufacturing new facts for things that are just there. I mean, if you poke the hole, you've poked the hole. Whether it still adheres, it should not make any difference. You know, I mean, what counts as poking a hole through a you know a punch card or whatever. So anyway, let me stop there because I've obviously gone over my time. I hope that reading this um, out loud has been somewhat more useful. If it isn't, you know, there's certainly other things we can do, but it is, I think, really important to get this sort of down, and and not that even as translated, it's perfect. It's highly imperfect. You can see that there are just, you know, there's a sentence here or a sentence there that have generated whole bodies of thought, like I tried to show with the general intellect thing from last week in the Italians, Italian post-war Marxism. It can get a little hairy. You know, that everyone believes that the Grundrisse comment on the general intellect is a much bigger thing than it might be. It's big, but I wouldn't necessarily go in a whole different kind of thing. Um, it, but it does express the kind of the type of thinking, the quality of thinking that Marx is going through when he tries to write this out. And of course, Engels with trying to mess with it in his own way. And then, of course, all these translators intervening, you know, the French version being different from the German version and then to English. And so we all have our little things going on in it. And if we sort of open ourselves to the idea that, you know, the answer, and particularly since we know that Marx was fluent in all three languages, so we don't, you know, we shouldn't get crazy about it because you know he does have a meaning there, and he does actually know all three languages. So it's there's something going on, and it may be something that we really have to look more carefully at and not get too focused on the words themselves, since just simple words have caused all kinds of trouble in intervening periods. So I may continue reading this as we go to section 3 tomorrow. I know this seems like Bible studies. It's not Bible studies. It doesn't have the, it's not very mystical, and I'm not, you know, miracles aren't going to happen. But I do think that in your own reading, and since, you know, we have a new translation and a kind of an approach that tries to make it more idiomatic, more colloquial, I hopefully people get these ideas down a little better because of the new translation. Now, whether it does or doesn't, it's a whole another set of readership questions. But you know, that's not my problem. I mean, it is my problem, but you know, fortunately, I'm not being paid to do it. Okay, no further comments, brickbats at all. I will, if it's yes, I am host, so I will shut down the live stream. Let me thank you for coming, and those of you who are listening, even while you're doing other stuff. I hope it makes a little bit more sense. I think it'll only mean more sense once you start reading it for yourself, to get this idea that, okay, um, people use stuff in, stuff gets used. It's utility. That's stuff. It changes when we start exchanging stuff, and it becomes more difficult when we do it at scale, because often we need some sort of standardized, a medium of exchanges. So we're to estimate, well, how much is that worth? Now, what it's worth and what you're willing to pay are obviously different. For friends of Rick, it's only 100 francs. For those of you who remember Casablanca. Um, these are things that the variable of price, it's not mystical. And in fact, once you get a better handle on it, you don't worry about things like people complaining, well, things are too expensive now. Now, the whole problem of that set of causality there, if I vote for Trump, my prices will go down, the price of things will go down. You're going to be sadly mistaken. Shit's going to get more expensive because you put that idiot there. But no one wanted to look at it. It's just a numerical thing. Um, it's not a Marxist thing at all. It just is. It's price behavior under demand, and you don't have to be a Marxist to think about it. You can just see that this is that tariff thing, because we know that Trump is clueless about tariffs. And he doesn't understand. I mean, I think he does understand. He just doesn't want to cop to it. That uh, domestic production or domestic distribution will shift costs to the consumer on this end, so it functions like a tax. So a tariff functions as a sales tax. It doesn't say tax, so it can't be tax because you didn't say it, but it is a tax, for God's sake. Anyway.